On May the 10th, 1869, in the hitherto unremarkable town of Promontory, Utah, a golden spike was driven into the ground, uniting the great transcontinental railroads of the Union and Central Pacific. It was an epic achievement, 1,780 miles of track linking Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California, along a route that would encourage settlement from coast to coast and create trade opportunities that would shape the future of a nation. The American pioneer, carving a place for his family at the frontier of a new world, is a familiar cultural icon, and the image of the Iron Horse, bringing technology, business, and progress to the Wild West, complements him perfectly. It's hardly surprising then that this image of industry and enlightenment should quickly find a place in the history of that other great fin de siècle innovation, cinema. In December 1895, the Lumière brothers frightened Parisian thrill-seekers under their seats with the first public exhibition of their film L'Arrive d'un train en gare de la Ciotat. Hollywood's silent age saw innumerable distressed damsels roped and wriggling on the railroad tracks as they waited for their leading man to save the day. But it was the Western that turned the railroad from mere scenery to cinematic scene stealer. In the golden age of the Western, the sight of a thundering steam train was as ubiquitous as smoke signals on a plateau or the sheriff's 10-gallon hat. It was a target for outlaws, an escape route for the desperate, an easy ride for drifters and migrants, and a connection to the wider world for burgeoning frontier communities. But Once Upon a Time in the West is not a typical Western. From the casting of legendary Hollywood good guy Henry Fonda as a ruthless killer, to Sergio Leone's unique blend of breathtaking realism and silver screen convention, Once Upon a Time in the West turns every movie cliché on its head. Here, the railroad, the ultimate 19th century symbol of progress and prosperity, becomes a dividing line between righteousness and avarice, between the ruddy-faced optimism of the settlers and the old-world corruption of the robber barons, who spread like germs across the unsullied West.
There is a political element to Once Upon a Time in the West, more so than the previous films, and it has to do with the railroad. Because the coming of the railroad is, if you like, the metaphor for the coming of civilization, but also for the coming of money and of power and of Eastern, old-style European power entering the frontier and corrupting it. And obviously the character of Morton, he's portrayed as a physically corrupted character, employing people who are morally even more corrupt than he. So there's a definite suggestion in the film that the forces of civilization are also the forces of corruption.
During the most explosive phase of railroad expansion, the U.S. government fell hopelessly behind in preparing the legislation needed to regulate this vital new transport network. Unfortunately, unscrupulous businessmen quickly spotted the opportunities for unbridled profit, and the age of the robber baron was born. As the sole owners of the railroads and adjoining land, these ruthless would-be tycoons held sway over their powerless tenants, charging exorbitant rents and shipping rates and quashing farmers' objections with hired muscle. In Once Upon a Time in the West, Gabriel Fersetti's Morton epitomizes the robber baron. Already a wealthy man, he has arrived in the new world with dreams of unparalleled riches and the hardness of heart to achieve his ends. His henchman, Frank, is an extension of Morton's own immorality. His murderous acts serve as a reminder that the sheen of respectability on Morton's business masks an ambition that supersedes ethics, justice, even the sanctity of human life. Although their goals are disparate, Frank desires only wealth, Morton a lasting legacy. The two men combine to illustrate the corruptive influence of unchecked financial prospecting in a territory originally opened up by the dreamers, believers, and idealists of the newly United States.
In comes the railroad with capitalism, the economic boom, Mr. Morton with all his cronies, you know, building this railroad, starting in the Atlantic and finishing in the Pacific, which of course never happened. You know, in real life, one company started in the east and the other company started in the west, and they met at Promontory Point in Utah. But Mr. Morton started in the east and wants to go to the... So what happens to those fairy tale characters when the trains arrive?
Morton may not share Frank's psychotic tendencies, but his willingness to ignore the ethical implications of employing a man who he knows will stop at nothing is indicative of the extent to which he is a slave to his own dreams. Above all else, the ailing Morton wishes to see the railroad finished before his death. Ultimately, though, and for all his wealth, Morton finds himself unable to rein in the force he has unleashed. The price he pays for his association with Frank is a violent death. Morton got his legacy. By 1900, almost every town in the continental U.S. was accessible by train. The railroad companies weathered corruption charges and monopoly legislation, expanding the track system to some 254,000 miles and, at their peak, employing a workforce of over 2 million. The railroad boosted American trade, kick-started domestic tourism, and even helped to shape the nation's taste in entertainment, carrying vaudeville performers, traveling theater, and the circus from town to town. Its dominance went unchallenged until the Great Depression of the 1920s and 30s, and by the time the U.S. economy had rallied, the Americans had a new way to get around: the motor car.